We have a 10-year-old daughter, Kaylee, our youngest. She's a part of a diabetes study at the Barbara Davis Center at the Ann Schultz Medical Campus. Kaylee doesn't have diabetes, but she has the genetic markers for them. I've learned more about genetic markers in the past 10 years than I ever thought I'd know. They took a sample of her cord blood right after she was born and determined she has the genetic markers for diabetes. So they asked her to be a part of this study that's happening actually across the world in a few different cities. And this study is trying to figure out if there are any environmental determinants that can influence whether or not a child develops diabetes. The name of this study is TEDDY, the environmental determinants of type 1 diabetes in the young. It took us a few years to be able to actually say that correctly. So every 6 months, Kaylee gets her blood drawn, and they test for diabetes, if she has any of the signs for it. But that's not all they do. Every 6 months, we fill out this 3-day diet record, and it's not simply a little bit of what she eats, but you have to track in detail, down to the teaspoon of salt, what she has eaten for 3 days. There is financial compensation for some of this, which there wasn't at the beginning and we didn't need it, but after doing these 3-day diet records, I take the money for that one. Kaylee gets the money for getting her blood drawn. I get the money for filling out what she eats for 3 days. But on top of that, they take toenail samples, they take samples from our tap water, they try to take samples from anything in her environment that may influence whether she does or doesn't develop diabetes. But one of the things they always ask, every 6 months, every appointment that we go to, they ask about anxiety and stress. But they do it in a really interesting way. I get a piece of paper laminated front and back, and she gets a piece of paper laminated front and back that has all these things that might have happened in the last 6 months. And we say whether or not something on that sheet of paper actually happened. And then they record whether Kaylee had a positive reaction to it, a neutral or a negative reaction. And it's all the major life stressors. Did you move? Did somebody lose a job? Was there a new job? Did you change schools or social networks? Was there a death in the family? Was there a death of a pet? Kind of just all the stuff you might imagine that they'd ask about your life. And I have to admit, we are quite thankful, because usually when we have these appointments, we might have one thing. More often than not, we don't have any of the major life stressors. She has an appointment next week. And that one's going to be interesting, because I think there's 5 or 6 different yeses we'll say. New jobs, new schools, new church, leaving friends, leaving schools. And I realized as I was kind of preparing for the sermon, we've had a lot of those major life stressors as a family in our last 6 months. And I wonder if Kaylee's blood will show up any different. I don't know. We probably won't really know that. But how interesting that one of the main questions they ask at every appointment has to do with stress and anxiety. As a 10-year-old, will it affect whether or not she develops diabetes? What does that say about how stress affects our life? We all know that stress and anxiety can have a negative impact on our health, especially when it's left unchecked, when we can't find ways to cope with stress or anxiety. How can it negatively impact our life? I have to admit, and I hate to admit it, but I've had to admit it to myself, so I might as well admit it to you. As I was thinking about all of the last 6 months and the stuff that Kaylee's gone through and we've all gone through, I realized I've let it negatively impact my health in that I've gained weight. I turn to food for comfort in anxiety. Some of you, in that response, I think you might as well. We have these life stressors and we turn to comfort. I like ice cream and I like popcorn. And I've told my kids, my 2 girls, that ice cream isn't an appropriate dinner. But man, every once in a while, there was an ice cream shop in the neighborhood we used to live at, which has actually been a good thing that we moved, because it was only 3 blocks down, and it was really good. And man, it can be a dinner in and of itself. What does stress and anxiety lead to? I would love to say that when I'm stressed, when I'm anxious, I exercise, or I clean house, or I do something a bit more productive. I open the fridge. I like food. But anxiety in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I actually think anxiety is actually a pretty neutral thing. It's normal. It's natural. You've probably had butterflies in your stomach at some point, and you get through it usually pretty easily. Sometimes we have more stress about something than another. It just is. Anxiety in and of itself, I don't think, is the barrier. I do think our response to the anxiety is what can become a barrier in our lives. And I've learned over the years, both in my own response to anxiety and in watching people and talking through with folks how they respond to anxiety, that there are two pretty common ways that we respond to anxiety that can become a barrier. The first, and this is that image of the big burly man and the mouse. The first way we respond to anxiety is we freeze up. We stop in our tracks. Anxiety can cause us to disengage, to pull back, to remove ourselves even from our own lives. And then, have you ever had anxiety about possible anxiety? I mean, we can really do ourselves harm. We can get in this vicious cycle about being anxious about what we might be anxious about. And we freeze up. We stop. Have you ever said no to something that really could have been a great experience because of anxiety? Have you ever been unwilling to try something new because of the stress of just thinking about it? Not even actually doing it, but just thinking about it? We freeze up. We disengage. We become unwilling to be present to the moment because of anxiety or the worry of anxiety. Have you ever withdrawn, just backed out, decided to stay home instead of something that could have really been life-giving? That's when it becomes a barrier, when the anxiety builds a wall between us and God and us and each other and even us and ourselves. We freeze up, unwilling to engage in whatever the situation. And then there's the second common response to anxiety, which actually brings us to the scripture for today. We're in the 4th chapter of Paul's letter to the Galatian community. And in this 4th chapter, Paul says, and this is according to the Message, earlier, before you knew God personally, you were enslaved to so-called gods that had nothing divine about them. But now that you know the real God, or rather since God knows you, how can you possibly subject yourselves again to those paper tigers? For that is exactly what you do when you are intimidated into scrupulously observing all the traditions, taboos, and superstitions associated with special days and seasons and years. I am afraid that all my hard work among you has gone up in a puff of smoke. Paul is reminding the people in this letter that their lives changed when they came to know Christ. Their lives changed when they accepted the grace and love of God. Before they knew God, before their lives had changed, they had turned to superficial comforts. They observed the laws and the traditions and the taboos, believing it was enough to just go through the motions, do what you're supposed to do, the way you're supposed to do it. Everything will be okay, even if your heart really isn't in it. Before they knew God, they walked through life, and yet they weren't really engaged in it. But now the people of Galatia know God. And why would they turn back to the old way of being? Why would they turn back to the old comforts, to the superficial comforts? Paul is dumbfounded. You can hear it in this letter. He's dumbfounded. He really doesn't understand why they're choosing what they're choosing, why they're going back, rather rather than accepting this abundant life that Christ offers. And this is where I had to admit that Paul is talking to me. You ever opened the scripture, read something, and went, oh man, it's talking to me and I have to really pay attention, especially if you don't want to. Paul, I think, is talking about the second common response, which is to find comfort in our stress, not through faith, not through relationship with each other, but in something else, something superficial, something that might make us feel good in the moment, but isn't lasting. It doesn't really answer that spiritual need. And as I said, for me, that is food. That comfort is food. I'm hoping I'm not the only one. Maybe I should be the only one. Have you ever had a craving for something, not really sure what it is? You go to the fridge, you open it, you take some food out, and you realize it wasn't hunger that you were craving? And yet, you go seeking the answer to that in something else? We turn to the superficial comforts and anxiety, and we create a barrier, we build a wall. We respond by trying to find comfort outside of ourselves: food, shopping, material things, alcohol, cleaning. I also, if I'm really honest, have to admit I over-organize. I'm getting ready to leave for a couple days this week to go to Chicago for a conference, and my dad is graciously stepping in to drive the girls in all of their after-school events. And I sent him about a 4-page document on where to go and what time and how to, I over-organized everybody's life for my own stress about leaving. In small cases, these aren't that bad. They don't seem like that big a deal. But if left unchecked, when we go to these superficial comforts to ease our anxiety, we can spiral into something much bigger. We can put up a barrier in relationships. We can build a wall, and our anxiety can take over. The Galatian community was experiencing anxiety. Paul addresses it. Their anxiety came because of change. They accepted this new way of being, and it changed their life. And change was occurring all around them. And it wasn't an easy path, and there were obstacles in their way. And in that anxiety, they chose in the moment, rather than going forward, they went back. They began to find comfort in their old routines and their old patterns and their old ways of doing things. And Paul is trying to shake them up. I think if he were there, he'd be slapping them in the face, that trying to get your attention. What are you doing? These old ways of being aren't going to bring you closer to God. The superficial comforts aren't going to bring you closer to God and to each other. Don't let anxiety become a barrier, because it is simply a part of life. I was in my head thinking, Christy and I in a moment will take the wall and we'll lay it at the altar, and wouldn't it be great to just put anxiety at the altar and never have to experience it again? To never be anxious, but that's not a possibility. We know that's not a possibility. Anxiety is a part of life. It will come. We don't have control over that. It simply is. But our response to the anxiety, that's what we have a say over. That's how we can choose God and faith and relationship over the simple comforts, or we can choose God and faith and relationship rather than freezing and withdrawing and disengaging. Because disengaging is a barrier. For me, ice cream is a barrier. We create these barriers when we don't have to. We can respond instead to openness, to God in the moment, to the willingness to move through the anxiety, trusting that God is with us, trusting that my dad can drive the girls where they need to be, trusting in the relationship with each other, and trusting in ourselves. God calls us to be present in our life. God calls us to be present to the moment, even or maybe especially when that moment is filled with anxiety. Paul is reminding the people of Galatia, and he's reminding us as well, we are called to be present because God is present to us and with us in every moment. And how do we respond to God? How do we respond in that moment of anxiety? How do we respond to the call? Luckily, Christy responded by saying yes. And so she's going to share her story of anxiety in her family. Thank you. Put this right here.
Good morning. There's sure a lot more of you at 9:30 than at 8 o'clock. I was asked to share a story today, anxiety. And if any of you would like to experience some anxiety, just be a storyteller. I would recommend it. I have always found worrying a very easy task for me. If you need someone to worry, I'm your guy. I'm good at it. My biggest worries, like most parents, are always about my two sons. My younger son went to Ecuador a year ago last May for a medical mission trip. I worried when he left, prayed for his safety. Lots of people told me, he'll be fine. Everything will be fine. This is great. Well, it wasn't. It was their last day in Ecuador, and they were planning to fly back that night. It was their sightseeing day after a week of treating about 130 patients a day. They were at the Cascadas de Paguche, a waterfall at an elevation of 9,000 feet. Jacob was on a trail with a few others when the ground gave way beneath him, and he fell 30 feet onto rocks and 4 inches of water. He was badly hurt, a compound break to his kneecap, several broken bones in his wrist, a broken nose, laceration through the face. He was carried out of the canyon and taken to the nearest hospital, and then a 2-hour ambulance ride to a private hospital. They wanted to do surgery immediately. We just wanted him home. Dr. Richard, an ER trauma doctor from Washington, D.C., and part of the medical mission trip, flew back with them. He was also the one that saved Jacob's fingers on his left hand by setting his wrist at the site. By the way, if you're going to have this happen, do it with a medical mission team because you've got doctors and nurses right there when it happens, which I know made a difference. After a couple of surgeries on the knee and wrist, he spent the summer recuperating and all of last year getting stronger. He had another surgery about 2 months ago. That should be the last one. He's back at CU, a junior in pre-med. He's thriving, he's healing, and he's looking forward to his future after his life-changing experience. My worry, my anxiety did not change what happened. It didn't prevent it. It didn't cause it. It didn't do a thing. Worry doesn't change things. Where does St. Luke show up in all this? When I received that initial phone call, I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico with my dear friend Renee Parra. A lot of you know her. I was with my St. Luke's friend, and she was with me through it all, and she still is. And isn't that St. Luke's? It's St. Luke's. We embrace each other, we walk beside each other, and we care through our joys and our tragedies. This community reminds us that God is with us through it all. My fear, my worry actually happened, and I made it through it. St. Luke's and God held me and my family.
Box was about to fall apart. Ken has since taped it, but it almost seemed fitting that anxiety would be falling apart as we brought it to the altar. Thank you,
Okay.
Christy.